HOA President Karen tows my car, didn't realize it was an unmarked police vehicle. It was a quiet, sunny afternoon when I finally got home with my father after another exhausting hospital procedure. The day had drained him, his face was pale, and his body trembled from the lingering effects of the treatment. I could see his exhaustion in his eyes as I helped him out of the car. My only goal was to get him inside and let him rest, he'd been through enough. But as I turned to lock the car, I saw her. There. Standing at the edge of our driveway. Arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across her face, Karen. Our HOA president. The sight of her made my heart sink. I knew right away that today was going to be anything but peaceful. She wasted no time. That vehicle is a violation of HOA regulations, Karen declared. Her voice sharp and filled with judgment. I could feel my patience thinning. Especially after the grueling ride home. I quickly explained. It's just a regular car. It's not a commercial vehicle. My father needs it close to the house. Especially after his procedure. But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she flicked open her laminated HOA rulebook and, with a dramatic flourish, began pointing out the fine print that supposedly justified her actions. We don't make exceptions for these rules, she said. Her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of wielding power. My father, exhausted and barely able to stand, looked at me with confusion. He didn't need this right now. But Karen wasn't about to let up. In that moment, I could feel the dread slowly creeping in. This wasn't just about a car, it was the start of something much worse. The words "tow truck's already on its way" hit me like a punch in the gut. I couldn't believe it, she had already called a tow truck without even giving me a chance to move the car. My hands shook as I helped my father out of the car, trying to keep him steady in his wheelchair. He was barely able to support himself. And here we were, fighting over a simple parking spot after what had already been a long and painful day. I shot Karen a look, my voice tight with frustration. "You've got to be kidding me." Her expression didn't change, though, and she simply gestured toward the street. "The truck is already on its way. And it's going to tow it. It's the rules." My stomach sank as I heard the rumbling of an engine growing closer. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy tow truck pulling down our street. I turned around just in time to see the massive truck slowing to a stop in front of our driveway. Its bright hazard lights flashing like a warning. The tow truck driver, a burly man who looked completely uninterested in anything beyond his job, hopped out, his clipboard in hand. He glanced at me briefly but immediately turned to Karen, as if she were his boss. "Which one, Mom?" he asked. Karen raised her hand, pointing directly at the sedan parked in our driveway. "That one," she said with satisfaction, like she was about to win some kind of personal victory. My heart raced. This couldn't be happening. I stepped forward, trying to maintain control over my emotions. "You're making a mistake," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "That car belongs to my wife. It's not a commercial vehicle. Please don't tow it." The driver hesitated, sensing something was off. He glanced at Karen for reassurance. Karen rolled her eyes, uninterested in any further explanation. "He's just making excuses," she snapped, waving her hand dismissively. "Hook it up already." Just as the situation seemed to reach its boiling point, a miracle happened. My wife's car appeared at the end of the street, slowly making its way down the road, her unmistakable black sedan gliding smoothly toward the driveway. As soon as she stepped out of the car, everything shifted. She exuded a calm confidence, her expression unreadable as she walked toward us. Sunglasses perched on her nose like a silent but powerful force. Karen, who had been so certain of her victory, immediately turned her attention to her, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, look who finally decided to show up," she sneered, pointing at my wife with a flourish. "I was just telling your husband that he's breaking the rules." But my wife wasn't fazed. Without even acknowledging Karen's remarks, she raised an eyebrow and coolly replied, "Is that so, Karen?" Karen tried to press on, turning her attention to the tow truck driver, as if she were putting on a show for the gathered neighbors. "He's been standing here, lying about the vehicle," she said with exaggerated annoyance, her voice rising. "He's claiming it's a police vehicle. But it's just a regular car." The air around us shifted, the tension palpable, as my wife casually reached into her back pocket. She pulled out a leather wallet, and flipped it open, revealing a shiny police badge. The metal gleamed under the afternoon sun, catching Karen completely off guard. For a brief moment, Karen's smug grin faltered. The silence was deafening. The tow truck driver, who had been uncertain, now stood frozen, his clipboard forgotten. Neighbors who had been watching the drama unfold muttered in hushed tones. And the weight of the situation settled over everyone. Karen's bravado had evaporated. The power dynamic had shifted. And she was no longer the one in control. "Still think we're lying, Karen?" my wife asked coolly, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. Karen's face turned ghostly white, her entire demeanor shifting from smug superiority to one of panic. It was clear to everyone present that she had miscalculated badly, despite the reality of her mistake settling in. Karen refused to back down. Her face was an unsettling shade of pale, but the defiance in her eyes told me she wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. She scoffed loudly, turning to the tow truck driver with all the arrogance of someone who had just been caught red-handed. "I don't care if she's a cop," Karen sneered, her voice sharp and venomous. "I'm enforcing the rules here. And she's just making excuses." The tow truck driver, still holding his clipboard, seemed to have had enough. "Ma'am, I'm not losing my job over this," he muttered, running a hand over his forehead. "You called me out here. But this car belongs to a police officer. I'm not towing it." His words were a quiet but firm rebuke to Karen. And for a moment, it seemed like the situation would diffuse. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat just yet. "No. No," Karen hissed, her face contorting with frustration. "I called for a tow because of the HOA rules. You don't get to decide what gets towed based on someone's badge." She was desperate now, almost pleading with the driver to go along with her. "Get to work already," she demanded, her voice high-pitched with irritation. The driver, unamused and clearly not wanting to get involved in her HOA drama, simply shook his head. "Lady, I don't care about your HOA. I care about getting paid. And if this car is government property, I'm not towing it. That's the law." He folded his clipboard under his arm, clearly done with the charade. Karen's face twisted with rage. She snapped, "Well, I'm not paying for this. You can't make me." Her fury was palpable. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The driver shrugged, Then you'll have to deal with it yourself. I'm done here. He turned to leave. But Karen wasn't finished yet. Fine. You're all useless, she yelled. But no one was paying attention to her anymore. The drama had reached its peak. And the neighbors began murmuring. Some with sympathy for us. Others with a clear sense of satisfaction at seeing Karen's cruelty backfire in such a public way. Despite the public defeat, Karen wasn't about to let it go. Over the following days, the mailbox quickly became a constant reminder of her relentless pursuit to make our lives miserable. Letters piled up, fresh violation notices. Each one more absurd than the last. The first notice was for something minor: my lawn was a tiny fraction too tall. The next one, a complaint about my wheelchair ramp, claiming it was unauthorized construction and demanding it be removed. The third, my mailbox, which Karen claimed had faded paint that didn't adhere to the HOA's color standards. Each letter felt like a slap to the face. But it was the emotional toll that hurt the most. I watched my father, already fragile and weakened by his health battles, struggle under the weight of these constant threats. He could barely read the notices, but he could feel the tension in the air. "Is it really worth it?" he asked one afternoon. His voice soft but laced with resignation as he sat at the kitchen table. A stack of letters in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as he tried to make sense of the bureaucratic mess. "Dad, none of this is your fault," I said, forcing a reassuring smile, though the stress was eating at me. "She's just lashing out because she can't stand being proven wrong. This is about her, not us," he sighed, his weathered face showing the signs of exhaustion. "I'm not the one who started all of this. All I wanted was to rest in my own home." I could see it in his eyes. He was tired, emotionally drained. The last thing he needed was a war over a few trivial complaints. But Karen wasn't going to stop. It wasn't just about a few rules for her, it was about control. And I was more determined than ever to stop her from turning our home into a battleground. I began to gather the documents, each letter, every fine, every piece of evidence. It was clear this wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was personal. And as I looked through the growing pile of violations, a thought started to form: Karen had done this to others before. And now it was time to bring her down for good. It seemed like every time we turned around, Karen found a new way to make our lives more difficult. One afternoon, as I helped my father onto the porch so he could enjoy some fresh air, we heard the all-too-familiar rumble of a tow truck. My stomach dropped. I turned to see the same black sedan, the one that belonged to my wife, being hooked up by the tow driver. And, of course, standing by, arms crossed and looking smug, was Karen. This time, I didn't hesitate. I rushed outside with my father in tow, my heart pounding in my chest. "You know that's a police vehicle, right?" I shouted, my voice sharp with frustration. "This is the second time you're trying to tow it. You can't keep doing this." Karen simply shrugged, as if her past actions were completely justified. "It has no visible markings. Looks commercial to me," she said with a flick of her wrist, her tone dismissive. Before I could respond, the familiar sound of sirens filled the air. A local officer, responding to a neighbor's call, stepped out of his patrol car and immediately assessed the situation. The officer took one look at the tow truck, then turned his attention to Karen. "Is this the same car you tried to tow last week?" he asked calmly. His gaze fixed on her. Karen? Clearly rattled now. Lifted her chin in defiance. It's a violation. You don't get to park that here. But the officer wasn't buying it. Local statutes and state law override HOA rules, he said firmly. His voice carrying authority. You can't keep calling a tow for a legitimate, legally parked vehicle, especially one that belongs to law enforcement. The tow truck driver, now visibly uncomfortable, looked between Karen and the officer. I'm not losing my job over this, he muttered, stepping back. This isn't worth it. Karen's face flushed crimson with anger as her attempt to assert control over the situation crumbled before her eyes. She turned to me, eyes filled with venom. This is harassment, she screamed, trying to deflect the blame. But no one was listening. Not anymore, as the officer issued a warning, and ordered the tow driver to leave. The tension that had been building over the past few weeks finally seemed to dissipate. But the real consequences for Karen were just beginning. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. And it wasn't long before officials from the city's housing department arrived to investigate her actions as HOA president. Within days, Karen's shady dealings came to light. Neighbors who had been quietly suffering under her oppressive reign began sharing their stories, of fines for trivial offenses, forced payments for dubious violations, and even rumors of embezzled HOA funds. Armed with evidence, my father and I compiled a detailed case against her. We gathered witness statements, receipts from neighbors, and photos of every violation she'd ever attempted to enforce. Then, one afternoon, as we sat on the porch watching the world go by, we saw two unmarked cars pull up outside Karen's house. A group of officials stepped out, accompanied by uniformed officers. We could only watch as they marched up to her front door. At first, Karen tried to put up a fight, yelling and waving her arms. But it was clear she had nowhere to hide. The officers forced their way inside, likely searching for the financial records that had been hidden for so long. The next moments felt like a dream. They escorted her out of her house, handcuffed, her face twisted with rage as she was led to the waiting police cruiser. "This is all a lie," she screeched, pointing wildly at me and my father. "You did this." But her words fell on deaf ears. The neighbors, who had gathered to witness the spectacle, watched in stunned silence as Karen's reign of terror finally came to an end. My father, his shoulders slumped with relief, turned to me with a soft smile. "It's over, son," he whispered. "She can't hurt us anymore." I could see the weight lifting off his shoulders as he finally felt the peace we'd been denied for so long. The neighborhood, once ruled by fear and intimidation, had been freed. If you enjoyed this wild ride and want to hear more crazy stories like this, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to deal with a nightmare neighbor or an overzealous HOA? I'd love to hear your experiences. Leave a comment and let's keep the conversation going. And of course, if you want to hear more stories just like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss out on the next crazy tale. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.